committee will come to order. I will now introduce our witnesses from panel 2. First, we've got Mr. Michael Holloman, Commercial Director and member of the Board of U.S. Strategic Minerals from St. Louis, Missouri. We've got Mr. Reno Franklin, Chairman of the Kashaha Band of Pomo Indians. He's a member of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation from Santa Rosa, California. Mr. Matthew Adams, Vice President and Senior Tax Counsel from the Navajo Transitional Energy Company from Broomfield, Colorado. And I'll yield to Representative John Curtis for 30 seconds to introduce our final witness, Mr. Brian Summers, President of the Utah Mining Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to introduce a good friend of mine, the President of Utah Mining Association, Brian Summers, former Managing Director, Utah Science, Technology, and Research Initiative, former Deputy Director, Utah Department of Heritage and Arts, and also worked for Governor Herbert, and I think of interest to many of us, former Congressman Mia Love. Brian, thanks for being here with us today. We look forward to your testimony.
We'll now hear testimony from our witnesses on panel 2. The chair recognizes Mr. Holloman to testify for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Westerman, and thank you, Ranking Member Grijalba and the rest of the committee. Thank you for having me here to testify on unleashing America's energy and mineral potential. My name is Mike Holloman. I'm here representing U.S. Strategic Metals in conjunction with National Mining Association. Our company, U.S. Strategic Metals, is the only primary cobalt, nickel, and nickel producer and processor, and importantly, recycler in North America. We are a green battery minerals platform that is working hard to close the final link in the supply chain loop that will lead us to raw materials independence as we work to meet the growing demand for renewable energy, batteries, and other high-tech applications. The timing of this discussion could not be better. America has, for all intents and purposes, leashed the energy industry. I have been all around the world. I've watched it for the last 20 years. We have effectively outsourced mining and processing. Why is this important? Because as it stands right now, we face a skyrocketing demand for renewable energy, and we do not control our own destiny as a nation for the raw materials needed to make this happen. I won't get into my background, but I can tell you that when the power of the lithium-ion battery was first realized, I watched our largest, most intelligent geopolitical rival start becoming interested in mining and processing of raw materials needed to make those batteries. I watched as American companies and the US government completely disappeared from the critical raw materials arena, content to receive last mile, just-in-time deliveries of the finished goods that were mined, processed, and upgraded everywhere but America. In countries that care a lot less about the environment than we do, in countries that care a lot less about the health and safety of employees than we do, and in countries that you all know turn a blind eye to child labor and worse. And yet, here we are, everyone using a laptop, everyone using an iPhone, many of us driving electric cars, all of which contain hard-to-trace lithium-ion battery metals that make those machines worse. And a lot of the technology for these batteries, which are changing the world, is invented by America. American companies invented this technology, and yet we don't mine or process any of the materials here. It is really a sad state of affairs. Hopefully I'll be able to get into the way our big rival has gotten into this. I spent a bunch of time in Africa watching them take over the natural resources there, but I would like to address the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is China. My former boss a year ago told the Financial Times, he said, if tomorrow China wanted to sell us cars instead of batteries, they could do it. So let that sink in. If tomorrow Chinese wanted to sell us just the batteries and the battery products, we would be buying XPeng, NIO, BYD cars, Ford, GM, Tesla, all of these great American electric vehicle companies would not be able to get the raw material supplies. So this is a conversation about national security as well as the environment. I see I could go on forever, but I hope most of you will read my comments. I have a lot to say in here. We can do it in America. We are doing it. U.S. Strategic Metals is mining in a green way, in a clean way. We are also processing low carbon, low emission, American ingenuity, American technology, hydrometallurgical processing. We're not using pyrometallurgical processing. Our mine is green and clean. We pay high wages. And I would just like to say that the point is we can do this mining and this processing here in America. We can do it the right way, but we need help. We need help from the government. We need help from you all to make sure that we have an ability to do it. The time to act, the best time was yesterday. The second best time to act is today. And I'd just like to thank you for your time, and hopefully we can dive into some of the issues that we face in the question and answer. I yield back my time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Holloman. The chair now recognizes Chairman Franklin for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Before I go any further, thanks for the water. It's appreciated. So, Heian Ma'iwa, Toshi's Chima, I am the Reno County Franklin. I'm the chairman of the Kashaya Pomo tribe. I'm also proudly Hawaiian as well. And thank you for this opportunity to sit in front of all of you today and talk. And also to my son back home for being patient on his 15th birthday, and his dad is here spending time with all of you. So thank you for that. I just want to talk a little bit about tribes. And you see my testimony's been submitted. I'm not going to go through the whole thing because you all have it in front of you, and you can, and I expect to answer some questions based off of my testimony as well. But really just want to talk about the role that the 1872 mining law plays in Indian country. I think it's important for you all to understand the impacts of mining and that it has on tribes. I'll start before getting into the impacts. I want to say that tribes are not necessarily opposed to mining. And tribes fully understand that we have minerals that are part of the country and the development of the country that keep us going. They keep the lights on, they keep the cars running, and in some cases, when the lights are off, they keep the batteries and those lights on, the temporary ones. So we recognize the importance. But I also want to say that when this law was created in 1872, these tribal rights were just not even a consideration. And they weren't worried about what are we doing on Indian lands and how are tribal people being impacted by this mining. Folks could just come out, apply for the mine or the permit for mining and then go out and do it. And that has left, in a BLM estimate of 500,000 abandoned mines on or near Indian country in the United States. And so in my statement of saying that tribes are not opposed to mining, what we are opposed to is unregulated mining. And that 1872 Act, yes, it's a regulation, but it doesn't regulate how mining impacts tribes. And I'm here today to talk to you all about that. I'm here to ask you to, in your consideration of possible reforms to the mining laws, possible additions, that as we look at a few things, as we look at the impacts to tribes, there's going to be a lot of discussion, as I imagine, as it was in the last panel as well, on timing and the permitting process. And, I want to point out to you all that tribes, we have tribal historic preservation officers. I am one of them. We implement Section 106 on tribal lands and do the consultations along with federal agencies and tribal governments. And one of the things that slows down the permitting process on Indian lands, especially for mining, is the lack of resources to tribal historic preservation officers. So as we look at how we find solutions to doing mining, and as you all consider it, I'm looking to this side, it's kind of empty, but I'm still going to look over there. As you all consider actions that you'll be asked and decisions that you'll be asked in the future to make, just my request to you, as not just as a chairman, not just as a father, but as a citizen of the United States, and as an Indian person who has a vested interest in making sure that my children inherit an environment, both botanical environment, but also very important, a historical, a sacred site environment that I enjoy and that all of our relatives have been able to enjoy, that you consider those things as you look at improvements to process, as you look at potential impacts to tribes, and as we move forward with hopeful reforms to a mining law from 1872, like I said, that really did not look at impacts to tribes or tribal nations. I'd like to point out to you also that when we have a couple of trees, you can get the seeds from trees and plant them in another place. And I know that because Class A faller, and as a former firefighter, I cut down a lot of trees and was asked a lot of time to assist with gathering the pine cones so that we could take that same stock and put it in another place and grow a forest somewhere else. I want to point out that cultural resources are non-renewable. Can't do that. When you destroy a sacred site, it's gone. It can't be brought back out. It can't be healed and fixed in the way that our forests can, or the environment around us. Happy to answer questions. Fully expect to have some pretty cool, zingy responses that I think we'll all enjoy. But more important, thank you for the time.
Chairman Franklin, thank you for your testimony and happy birthday to your son. The chair now recognizes Mr. Adams for 5 minutes.
Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Grijalva, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Matthew Adams. I'm Vice President and Senior Tax Counsel for Navajo Transitional Energy Company, also known as NTEC. Navajo Transitional Energy Company was formed in 2013 as part of a groundbreaking initiative by the Navajo Nation to assert and assume full sovereignty over its vast mineral and energy assets. NTEC was established under Navajo law and is an autonomous limited liability company whose sole shareholder is the Navajo Nation. NTEC's initial objective was to take control of the Navajo mine, which is located on the Nation just outside of Farmington, New Mexico. In 2019, NTEC acquired all of the assets, substantially all of the assets of Cloud Peak Energy, and thereby became the third largest coal producer in the United States. Our coal portfolio includes the Navajo mine, which is the mine mouth that feeds the Four Corners power plant on the Nation. We also have the Antelope and Cordero mines, which are in Wyoming, and the Spring Creek complex in Montana. In 2022, we produced 52 million tons of coal, 49 of which stayed domestic, and just over 3 that went international to the Asian Pacific. In addition to owning and operating coal mines, NTEC owns and operates helium wells on the Navajo Nation. We have an ownership percentage in the Four Corners power plant. We have an ownership interest in the Round Top rare earths deposit in Texas. We just announced a partnership with Arizona Lithium for the development of the Big Sandy lithium project in Arizona. We continue to work closely with the owners of Four Corners Power Plant to develop a large-scale merchant power solar facilities on reclaimed mine land on the Nation. We truly represent and strive for an all-of-the-above answer and answers for our energy problems and our energy needs. If there is new technology that's going to be developed and we believe it can provide energy for the Nation to help the United States or beyond, we're going to be interested and we're going to be there. In addition to what we do, we're very proud of how we do it. Our steadfast focus on safety gets our people home safe. Our stewardship for the land, we lead by example. Last year, the Navajo mine was the first mine in the United States to earn both the National Mining Association Sentinel of Safety, one of the highest safety awards in the United States, and the U.S. Department of Interior's National Reclamation Award of the same year. We are also an essential contributor to the Navajo Nation. Through royalties, taxes, and payments, NTEC provides 30% of the Navajo Nation's general fund, 30% on an annual basis. Further, the Four Corners Power Plant provides another 9%. So 39% is coming from our mine mouth operation on the mine. That plant is currently scheduled to close in 2031. I want to hit some key points that I want to make sure that we get it out and that we can talk about today. Coal continues to be an essential resource for the United States. This is true from an energy reliability perspective as well as from a federal revenue perspective. In fact, as I started speaking today, PGM, right now, 18% of their electricity is coming from coal. In the middle third of the United States, MISO, 30%, and SPP, 33%. So today, on a nice day, a moderate day, with good wind, there's some sun, coal is still doing a third of the work out there. We believe that above all should be above all. Coal needs to stay in the mix. Coal needs to be that base load. Last year, we provided 21% of the base load in the United States. We need innovation, not elimination. We need to shift the focus away from what fuels the plant to how we utilize technology and innovation to ensure that the emissions are where we want them to be. The United States coal fleet has invested approximately $127 billion in emission controls through 2022. In 21, the United States coal fleet emitted 909 million tons of CO2, which was 18%. It was only 18% of the 4.9 billion from energy-related CO2. Global greenhouse gas emissions are estimated to be in the magnitude of 49.8 billion tons in 2020. The United States coal fleet was less than 1.5%. We need to develop a deliberate strategy for a conversion from fossil fuels that does not put lives at risk, does not hinder the economy, and is thoughtful and practical. A coal plant should not be retired before there's comparable replacement energy online. Technology has not advanced to the point where we can do that yet. The reliability of the grid is at stake, and recent grid emergencies from storms have shown that. There are significant issues with the current permitting processes. The United States should look for ways to maximize our coal exports. The revenue from the royalties, as well as replacing coal that is mined in unethical, unenvironmentally friendly ways, we can do that. Finally, I'd like to hit later on the amount of coal that's burned in the United States is absolutely immaterial to what is being burned in China and the rest of the world. The United States will burn a half a billion tons this year, 500 million. The world will burn over 8 billion, half of that being from China. With my time ended, I will conclude my comments.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Mr. Summers for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Chairman Westerman and Ranking Member Grijalva and the rest of the committee for the opportunity to appear today. And thanks also to Congressman Curtis for being Utah's voice on this committee. I'm Brian Summers, president of the Utah Mining Association, which was founded in 1915 and represents Utah's hard rock, coal, and industrial mineral mine operators and related support industries. UMA also worked closely with the National Mining Association and other state and regional industry groups. UMA's mission is to advocate on behalf of Utah's mining industry, its workers, and the communities they support. Mining is a critical industry in Utah, contributing $7.7 billion to the state's GDP, supporting nearly 57,000 direct and indirect jobs, and powering Utah's broader economy by producing the coal, which provides 62% of Utah's low-priced electricity. Mining jobs in Utah are family and community-sustaining jobs, with mining salaries averaging over $83,000 annually, which is 37.5% higher than the average Utah wage. It's important to recognize mining is something most people never experience firsthand, and yet they benefit from the products made possible by mining every single day. From smartphones to medical devices, consumer electronics, to new energy technologies and national defense systems, our modern economy and quality of life are supported by mined minerals. Demand for minerals is expected to increase radically in coming years, yet domestically produced minerals currently meet less than half of the needs of U.S. manufacturers, creating an untenable strategic vulnerability for our economic and national security. To put this demand in the context of the energy goals of the Biden administration, a 2021 International Energy Agency report stated that, quote, to hit net zero globally by 2050 would require 6 times more mineral inputs than today, close quote. A 2022 report on copper demand from S&P Global also stated, quote, substitution and recycling will not be enough to meet the demands of electric vehicles, power infrastructure, and renewable generation. Unless massive new supply comes online in a timely way, the goal of net zero emissions by 2050 will be short-circuited and remain out of reach, close quote. Our nation's lack of a clearly defined minerals policy is undermining our ability to supply our own mineral needs and support future economic growth. The U.S. mine permitting system is duplicative, inefficient, and unpredictable, leading to an average federal permitting timeframe of 7 to 10 years. Compounded by the inevitable litigation from environmental groups, the U.S. permitting process is one of the longest in the world. Countries like Canada and Australia, which have stringent environmental safeguards like the U.S., can get mines through permitting in 2 to 3 years. In Utah, mines on state and private lands can be permitted in a timeframe similar to those of Canada and Australia. However, 2/3 of Utah's land which contains many of our state's substantial mineral resources, is controlled by the federal government. The current federal permitting regime obstructs domestic mining and blunts our ability to compete globally. Lengthy delays deter investment and encourage dependence on countries like China, Russia, and the Congo, which have abysmal environmental, labor, human rights, and governance records. According to the 2023 USGS mineral commodity summaries, the U.S. is more than 50% dependent on foreign imports for a staggering 51 important mineral commodities, including 15 commodities for which we are 100% import reliant. China was the largest single source of foreign mineral imports in 2022. This import reliance is a threat to our nation, and it is unnecessary. Of those 51 mineral commodities for which the U.S. is more than 50% import reliant, Utah has current production, historical production, or established resources for 20 of them. Fully developing our mineral potential in Utah, just one state, could significantly diminish our country's need for foreign imports. Imagine if we could responsibly develop all of our nation's vast mineral estate, guided by our world-class environmental and safety standards and employing a highly skilled and highly paid workforce. To encourage investment in America's mineral resources, both in mineral production and in processing, the federal government must fix its broken permitting processes, set clear timeframes, establish a lead agency to promote certainty and accountability, and enact policies that ensure access to mineral deposits. I applaud Chairman Westerman for introducing the Securing America's Mineral Supply Chains Act and Congressman Stauber for reintroducing his Permitting for Mining Needs Act. These bills will enable our nation to responsibly develop our mineral resources, reshore supply chains, support domestic manufacturing, and secure our economic and national security. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Summers, and thank you again to all the witnesses. We're now going to go to member questions. We're going to start with Mr. Carl from Alabama. I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Summers, the Alabama Graphite Belt, which is located in Coosa County, Alabama, has some of the world's best reserves of a critical energy material, but a lack of commitment to these resources has led to the suspension of the development over the last several decades. Simple question. How does the United States government plan to encourage the private sector to redevelop graphite resources in order to maintain America's ability to access critical materials as and when needed, rather than relying on China or other unreliable foreign suppliers?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that, we don't have any graphite resources in Utah. I wish we did, but we have a lot of other critical minerals that have also either not been developed or they've had to stop development. And I think that for the federal government to focus again on permitting issues that, add a lot of delays to the process, and also to encourage and incentivize domestic manufacturing and processing. In many cases, the reason that we don't have these minerals produced in the U.S. is because, frankly, they're produced more cheaply elsewhere. And a lot of that is a function of, as I mentioned in my testimony, because you've got countries that don't have the same kind of environmental and labor safeguards. And in some cases, there's flat-out market manipulation where they will sell critical minerals into the market, into the commodities markets for less than what they cost to produce. And so I think until we find ways to incentivize production of some of these mineral resources, and in some cases even require them, if that's, if there's a national defense system or something else that calls for some of these resources, it's going to be very difficult for us to continue to compete on a global scale.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to submit a letter from Warner Met Coal for the records.
Without
I can get that
objection,
entered.
so ordered.
Mr. Adams, my district, which has the Port of Mobile, we're very proud of our coal exporting there. In fiscal year 2022, the port exported about 10 million metric tons of met coal. For those of y'all that don't know what met coal is, it's coal that's primarily targeted for the metal industry, molten metals. We're in a unique situation in Alabama in that we mine it in central Alabama, which supply the jobs and obviously everything that spins off in Jasper and up in central Alabama. We bring it down the river system that we've been so blessed with into the Port of Mobile. In Port of Mobile, it creates many, many jobs, which we take and we load it on vessels. Most of these vessels are going to Brazil. They go to Brazil where they're used in the furnaces there. They're heated into metal. The metal comes back to the Port of Mobile. It's unloaded in the Port of Mobile. We take it up to our steel mills, which are right up the river system. It is stamped out, and it winds up in one of your automobiles that you're probably driving today, whether it be a Mercedes. We have about 7 different manufacturers in Alabama, and it's all done because of met coal. That's where it all starts. That's what I want us to focus on here real quick. Can you discuss the economic benefits if you were able, because you have a similar situation, obviously, on the Navajo Nation, which I'm very sensitive to anything dealing with our ancestries there. Can you discuss the economic benefits if we were able to export our coal to more locations throughout the United States? Would it be a similar story? And what barriers are in place to increase you to export that?
Congressman, thank you for your question. We actually export thermal coal as well, but we have huge roadblocks in being able to do that. The Port of Mobile is a world-class port. I wish we had 15 of them around the United States. The jobs that Mobile has, the economy that is built off of that shipping, everyone should be envious of that. And that opportunity is there for many other states, for many other cities who do not take it. We could easily place 40 million plus tons a year into the Asian market. They love American coal. It is consistent. It is high quality. We would get most in the West, most of ours on federal land. So the federal government would get 12.5% of that revenue. But we've had every coal port on the West Coast shut down. Governor Inslee in Washington, or the Corps of Engineers, Army Corps of Engineers, have shut down every single project to export coal out of the West. So that puts a lot more pressure onto the limited coal ports that there are. The East is lucky with the met coal. We don't have met in the West. We're all thermal, with few exceptions. But we need more ports. We need to participate. We need to replace Russian coal in the international market, which is absolutely a player. We need U.S. coal in that revenue.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chair?
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Curtis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses. This is a great hearing. As I listened to your testimonies, it caused a lot of reflection in my mind. Gentlemen, I represent, as Brian knows, a district in Utah that has a county by the name of Carbon County. I'd love to ask my colleagues here, what do you suppose they do in Carbon County? And what I've seen over the 5 years that I've represented them is what I call the demonization, and unfortunately, not just the demonization of coal, but the demonization of people. And what's unfortunate about that is these are the very people who have sacrificed their health, have sacrificed their safety for generations and generations, so the rest of us can go over to a wall switch and flip on the switch and have the lights come on and keep the temperature at 70 degrees. And I wish more often people felt a little more connection with where this power source came from and appreciation for these very, very good men and women. And Mr. Franklin, much of this is the Navajo Nation. I take in about a third of the Navajo Nation. There's about 5 tribes that have a connection, even though they don't all live in my district. And I've watched things like the Hopi Nation lose 80% of their revenue when they shut down the coal-fired power plant there by Antelope Island. And sometimes we talk about environmental justice, and I wonder where is the justice to these communities dealing with these issues? And I think frequently, because it's unseen, that it's not dealt with. And Mr. Franklin, I also express a commitment to better understand some of the things that you've told us in your testimony and how it impacts those people. I know there's a lot of uranium mines that have not been resolved, not just in the Navajo area, but throughout my district. I think it's important that as we go forward, we also look back and make sure we're being good stewards there as well. Imagine the hypocrisy in Carbon County when they see that there's actually not enough coal coming out of their coal mines for the coal-fired power plant there because it's going overseas to Europe at a much higher price and being burned by our European counterparts who brag and shout from the housetops how clean they are. And yet, they're paying sometimes upwards of 400% more for that coal than the contracts in those local coal plants are. And it's viewed as nothing but hypocrisy, right, by these good men and women. And Mr. Summers, thank you for being here. You mentioned in your testimony this problem that we have, that 2/3 of our state is owned by the federal government. That's exasperated in much of my district. Now, wrap your arms around this. 7 of the counties I represent are 90% federally owned. So imagine trying to eke out a living, an economy, anything when 90% of the land doesn't pay property tax, where there's an attack to keep all mining off of these federal lands. And Brian, somehow the state is able to regulate these and meet the high standards where the federal government isn't. What lessons would you like the federal government to learn from Utah's permitting program that we might be able to implement federally?
Thank you very much, Congressman. I think that, again, in Utah, if a mining operation is primarily on state or private lands and doesn't have a significant federal overlap, again, we can get them through permitting process in 2 to 3 years versus 7 to 10 years on the federal side. And I think a lot of that is just the fact that there are clear delineations of authority and responsibility to our state agencies. So, you don't have this massive overlap where you never quite know exactly where your permit is in the process and which agency you need to go and talk to. And I think even just that one step of having a centralized, agency of primary lead agency for permitting on the federal side would be a great first step to take.
Are you aware of any shortcuts or environmental damages that occur because our process is 2 or 3 times quicker?
No.
Could anybody here point to anything that puts the land in jeopardy because our processes are 2 or 3 times quicker?
No, and I think that part of the advantage, frankly, of having the state, have primacy in some of these permitting processes is the fact that if something does go wrong, if there is a local concern, you actually know who to go and talk to. You can talk to the head of DEQ, the head of DOGM, our Division of Oil, Gas, and Mining. You can talk to the member of the legislature that represents those communities, and there's much more political accountability.
I wish I had more time. Thank you, witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Ms. Ledger Fernandez from the state of New Mexico for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Westerman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for bringing this hearing together, and what a wonderful panel. I have read your written testimonies and know a lot about some of the issues around here. I want to begin by recognizing the really hard work of the people, men and women, who work in the mining industry, who have powered our nation up to this point. Like, we need to recognize how essential that was and is. And Mr. Adams, I think that is, you're showing that, right, on the Navajo Nation as well. And I think that there's an interesting difference about what's happening on the Navajo Nation when it is itself controlling its destiny and what it wants to do with its minerals. That is, in essence, what you are working on behalf of the Navajo Nation, correct?
That is correct. As an autonomous energy company, helping the Navajo by managing and producing off of those assets and helping the nation.
Yeah. I mean, and that's great. And I want to contrast that with the 1872 mining law, right? In the 1872 mining law, we are basically, because we haven't updated that, imagine just to say 1872 and the idea that we haven't updated a law from a couple of centuries ago, right? It's like we don't have, it's 18, right? And the fact that some of the companies that are coming in and seeking to exploit the resources and to take those precious materials that we do need for so much of what we have. Like, a lot of them are actually foreign corporations. And because of the way the 1872 mining law is structured, we have subsidiaries of Chinese companies, right, in Arizona looking for mining. In Pecos, which is where my family is from, there is a desire to have additional mining. It is also a foreign company that is doing that. And that's why I think these resources are precious, but they are American resources. I wanted to also, touch on the fact that there is a lot of damage still left behind, as you noted, right? From the uranium mines, the Gold King spill mine. My constituents have come to me and we've worked on those issues together. But I wanted to turn a bit to TIPOs and the role that they need to play. And thank you so very much, Chairman Franklin, for what you have done in pushing these issues. Do you believe that the current 1872 mining law provides adequate environmental protections for mining projects located near tribal lands? And what would you suggest as updates?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like it's being a Major League Baseball hitter and having a softball thrown at you. So yeah, absolutely. It fails tribes. The 1872 law does, and a good example of it is our brothers and sisters in Tono Autumn. And I want to apologize first that I'm going to mention human remains and that tribe specifically, and mean this in no disrespect whatsoever. But I think it can't be ignored. The Animax mining company that had gone into the Santa Rita Mountains and mined, and in the process damaged severely a large village site, left human remains on the surface. It mined right through their cemetery, and it destroyed artifacts and sacred sites. And that's kind of what I was talking about earlier. This is the kind of thing that we need to avoid, but that happens because there's nothing to protect inside of that law. And that's, by the way, that is not even an American company. And when they went bankrupt, they left it all on the surface. And now there's another company that is from Canada that's trying to come in and assume that mine again. And so, it's just examples and ways that we need to be better, I think, protect not just Tono Autumn's history or American Indians' history, but really is the history of the entire country as well.
And this sort of abandonment of mines happens way too often. That is indeed the case, where taxpayers then end up holding the bag for remediation, right? And the need for the cleanup. And I really want to look forward to working with the chairman and my colleagues so that we could reauthorize the Historic Preservation Fund. I carried a bill on that because all the work that we need to do, it can be done, right? I think that there is an understanding that there is a way of doing this important work, but it is how you do it and where you do it that is very important. We need to answer those questions before we start digging up some cemeteries. And I offer, my shared sadness about the fact that there is indeed what happened, as you pointed out. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Summers, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate and share your passion for mining, like in Utah. It provides family-sustaining wages along with the pride of supplying our nation with our resources, just like in my district in northern Minnesota. And I also want to thank you for mentioning my bill, the Permitting for Mining Needs Act. In Section 3, it limits environmental assessments and environmental impact statements to 1 and 2 years respectively. Can you discuss how limiting these timeframes will expedite the permitting process and also clarify that even with a time limit, we can ensure all environmental safeguards?
Thank you, Congressman. As has been discussed, even with the previous panel, a lot of the problems that we run into with federal permitting is the fact that these processes can be dragged out for years and years and years, and there's not strict timelines that are established in federal law that would help to expedite these processes. And again, if you look at foreign countries like, as I mentioned, Canada, Australia, these are countries that have very similar environmental safeguards that we do. And the mining industry wants to develop the mineral assets of this country in an environmentally sensitive way. That being said, you can have a rational time frame that allows for adequate environmental review without stretching these things out to 7 to 10 years and beyond.
Well, Mr. Summers, I would say that I've heard you and a couple other folks say that, 3 to 5 to 7 years for mining. I'll let you know that in the Duluth complex in northern Minnesota, the biggest copper nickel find in the world, which Joe Biden just banned mining in that district. But there's a company in its 20th year of permitting, and then there's another one within 9 years of permitting process. And it's just unfortunate, especially if we want to hold ourselves to the highest environmental and labor standards we mine in America. Thank you very much. Mr. Holloman, thank you for joining us today. Your testimony, like Mr. Summers, discussed how our foreign rivals control the international minerals market. It also briefly discusses the Inflation Reduction Act, which we were told was meant to reduce inflation. But according to your testimony, it allows metals mined in Indonesia, for example, and processed in China to qualify for IRA funding. Is this true, and can you expand on how these IRA funds also boost Chinese manufacturing?
That's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked it. It was a shock to me. I just came back from Korea, where I was talking to some of the big FTA battery companies, and they were discussing the IRA and the domestic content requirements. Now, as far as I know, these domestic content requirements are not settled. It is still being discussed. There's a negotiation. But the Korean battery makers were interested in doing business in America, in building processing in America, in partnering with groups like us. And yet they were conflicted because they were being told by US OEMs that, you know what, you already have processing of Chinese-owned Indonesian metal that goes to a 49% Korean-owned processing plant in China, and that will qualify. All we have to do is send it in an intermediate product and then roll it into a battery in America, and that's going to qualify. And this is something that I think needs to be known, that is not right. I've spoken to people right and left that say, no, that's not the intent of the law.
What you just described, excuse me, but what you just described is American taxpayer money going overseas to foreign, in some cases adversarial nations, to mine those critical minerals.
It will be if we're giving a $7,500 taxpayer rebate for an electric vehicle that has its metals mined and processed by the Chinese. So that absolutely will happen. It hasn't happened yet because we don't have that implementation, but it's coming soon, and we need to get ahead of it. It's something I think it's important for you all to know, that cannot be the domestic content requirement. We need it to be processed and mined in the USA. We can do a lot of it here, or the free trade agreement countries as well, but let's try to get as much as we can, especially nickel and cobalt, here.
Agree. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and I recognize Ranking Member Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Summers, question. The part of the discussion, almost the entire discussion, has been about NEPA and how it slows the ability for full extraction of gas, oil, mining, et cetera. Another piece of legislation that guides the mining industry is 1872 law. And like was stated about NEPA, that it's time to fine tune it, bring it up to date to these times. Do you feel the same? Do you feel that this committee should explore that as well with the 1872 mining law?
Thank you for the question. I think that any federal statute is not going to be perfect, and there's opportunities to refine them, but I do think that it's necessary to clarify that the mining law of 1872 is a land tenure law. It's the law that guides how you get the legal rights to develop mineral opportunities here in the U.S. It's not an environmental protection or conservation law. For that,
Okay.
we've got NEPA, we've got the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, we've got NAGPRA. I mean, there's a number of different, yeah.
Thank you, sir. It's just the 1970s and the 1870s. That's the difference I was trying to draw to. Mr. Holloman, do you feel, as part of, and you mentioned in your testimony the having to do business with foreign mining entities, multinational corporations that work in other parts of the world that exploit people, horrible labor standards, no concern for environmental protections or clean air, clean water issues. Do you feel those kind of entities should be allowed to do business if they're violating it at that level in other countries, do business on public lands and waters here in the United States?
Absolutely not.
And any look at going forward in the future, those kinds of bans and restrictions would be appropriate? Let's say Rio Tinto, who has a horrible history in other parts of the world, but has major mining industry here in the United States, they be banned from doing business on public land?
They should be looked at very closely. The foreign entities that are not keeping the standards up to American standards elsewhere in the world must be looked at. The Congo, for example, you have all types of mining.
Let me, and thank you, Chairman Franklin, for being here with us. I think one of the misunderstood issues about something is being slowed down in terms of the points that you were making fails to recognize that in many, whether it's Oak Flat, whether it's the Ottoman Santa Rita, whether it is other issues affecting tribes, whether in Nevada and other parts, the issue of sacred sites, cultural and historic resources, why they need to be brought up in the consideration, evaluation, and analysis, and the consultation with the tribes.
Yeah, there's
Talk about that importance and why many of the conflicts we see out there between Indian country and a mining entity or another development has to do with that core issue.
Right. So let me first say that the reason why I think that Navajo's outfit is working so well is they're accountable to their own people. When you bring foreign interests in, they're not accountable to the United States people, unless we hold them accountable. And that's what I would look to all of you to do, and my colleagues up here. The importance of sacred sites and how that connects. A Canadian mining company doesn't care what they're doing to indigenous people in the United States. It's maybe they do, but they sure haven't been showing it, right? Once those resources are gone, like I was saying earlier, they're gone. You know, when you disrespect the tribal burials like that by just, coming and mining and leaving the human remains on the surface, not even giving them the dignity of reburial, or even inviting the tribe to come along and assist. So those are just things that as a country I think we're better than. As a Congress, I know that you're better than, right? And you all have the opportunity to stop those kinds of foolishness from happening. And I know that it's something that is of interest with you as well. Sacred site protection is of the utmost importance, to American Indian tribes. It's right up there with language, right up there with safety, and right up there with our families.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. If Mr. Adams, the Navajo Nation consistently, regardless of the administration, their elected officials have voted consistently, resolution and action after action, banning uranium mining on in the nation, banning the transport having to do with the legacy. And as a partner of the Navajo Nation in the business relationship, how do you feel about that?
I appreciate the question. I can't represent the Navajo Nation or the thoughts of the government. I know that there are a lot of difficult decisions that were made in the past. I know that the policy right now is that they've had issues with uranium and they don't want to deal with it. What the future holds, what the new President Bo Nygren is going to do with that, we don't know at this point. We are not pushing on uranium angles.
With that, yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Summers and all of you gentlemen, thank you for being here today. Mr. Summers, thank you for your statements, and you highlighted in your testimony the fact that mining is something most people don't experience firsthand yet they benefit from its results every day. I agree with that fact in that statement, and that is particularly true of the folks who live right here in Washington, D.C. Wyoming, however, is a mining state, and from being the home of the world's largest trona deposits to its abundant coal reserves, uranium mining, and countless other minerals, mining is a way of life in our state and a major driver of our economy. When Joe Biden wages war on American mining alongside radical environmental groups, our state suffers and America suffers. My question to you is, how has the messaging of this administration towards the mining and coal industry impacted our state's abilities to generate revenue, as well as our ability as a country to lower electricity costs for the consumers?
Thank you for that, Congresswoman. I think that the messaging is unhelpful, and it's also a little confusing, frankly. I mean, when you talk about some of the new energy technologies and the energy transition goals of the Biden administration, but then you're withdrawing huge tracts of federal land from development, as Congressman Stauber talked about, as we've seen in Alaska and elsewhere, and in Utah. And we have two very large national monuments that have locked up substantial mineral resources. And in terms of being able to develop, and bring the investment that's needed to develop our mineral resources, which are very expensive and complicated to develop, if you've got messaging from the federal administration that says, on the surface, yes, we want to do all this stuff, but then as you get into federal permitting, as you get into land withdrawals and all the other things that have been talked about, it sends a very mixed message. And so I do think that it hinders our ability to attract the investment that we need. And I think also on the coal side, we're a very coal-heavy state as well. As I mentioned, 62% of our electricity comes from coal. And, to have those coal communities constantly hearing that, we're shutting down your plants, we're shutting down your mines, makes it difficult to also get these younger generations of workers to want to come in and work in these very high-paying and highly skilled jobs.
Thank you. Over 40% of the coal that is produced in this country comes from my state, from the state of Wyoming. So we play an essential role in keeping electricity costs low for Americans. I think it's rather unfortunate that this administration doesn't see the direction the entire world is going with coal production. Coal is the second largest source for U.S. electricity. Germany and Asian nations have seen a large increase in their reliance on coal power. I know and firmly believe that coal is the energy of the future, and as radical environmentalists try to force their countries into an electrified transition, the world is not ready in terms of minerals mined and processed, lack of infrastructure, and more. Coal, however, is there time and time again to keep the lights on. Mr. Summers, again, can you explain why the U.S. continues to rely so heavily on coal and why other nations are seeing an increase in their reliance on coal for power?
Absolutely. Again, part of this is, you use the resources that you have available in your state because there's benefits beyond just providing that inexpensive and reliable dispatchable power. It also has benefits in terms of creating jobs, creating royalties, and monies for federal or for local economies. And I think that part of the reason that the world is moving in that direction of using more coal is the simple fact that we have an energy crunch generally. You've seen natural gas prices that have risen substantially. You've seen disruptions in supply. The renewables have not produced in the manner that we were promised that they would produce, and so you need that reliable, dispatchable, inexpensive power, and people will get it. I mean, we're shipping coal to Europe. We're shipping coal to other parts of the world that we haven't shipped to for decades, frankly, because there's so much demand out there because of the general shortage of energy that we have. And coal's an important part of making sure that people don't freeze to death, frankly.
Coal is affordable, it's accessible, it's clean, and it's the energy of the future. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely.
As I mentioned, certain countries have had to rely more on coal or nuclear energy and power to make up for shortages that are a product of their attempt to force an electrified transition before the world is ready. Our nation prepared for the electrified future they envision, and whether these Biden administration policies run the same risks here in the United States.
Yes, I mean, as has been mentioned, there's massive mineral demand that's required for new energy technologies and for energy transition. And frankly, the federal policies around developing those minerals are not adequate to make sure that we meet that demand. You know, we do produce a lot of coal, but we also are a major copper producer. We're one of only 2 states that produces lithium. We produce magnesium metal. We produce a lot of things that you need for all of these energy technologies. But, you know, the federal policies are not, again, encouraging investment, and in some cases are discouraging the development of these resources in an adequate way.
Well, and thank you, gentlemen, for making our lives better. I yield back.
Ladies, time's expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And some of those that you just rattled off, Mr. Summers, we have right in the great state of Wisconsin, and we're not being allowed to mine them with some of the toughest environmental regulations you'll find anywhere in the world. Mr. Franklin, good to have you here today. In your statement here, the government can create fairness in this process by mandating consultation. Are there states that are not consulting with tribes?
Yeah. And so as a part of the Mining Act, you see that happen. And I won't say states that aren't consulting, because states, you know, our states do a good job of reaching out to tribes and discussing. But for the purposes of this Mining Act, absolutely. But for the purposes of states, they do.
So if you could share with me a list of the states that don't consult with the tribes, because I think about the state of Wisconsin. I mean, we specifically have a consultation process, and I'd be very surprised that there's a state that isn't. But if there is, I'd sure like to see that list, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no problem. And I have some staff behind me from the National Association of TIPOs that can work and probably get you a list of projects where the consultation that was done was extremely poor. But I will compliment you on your state. You all have done a fine job. And Menominee certainly is a tribe that has discussed consultation with your state and it being inclusive.
Sure. You also state in here, we do not ask for disproportionate power. Recognize the importance of mining. Once again, who is out there that's not giving the information that the tribes want? Because we consistently have that.
Oh, you brought it for the answer.
Yeah.
So I actually have in my written statement, I have a really good example of that with Tono Autumn Nation, and I just discussed it a little bit ago. You know, and in this case, these were 2 foreign mining companies that came in and destroyed their village. But that plays out multiple times across federal lands when being granted the right to come in and mine under this 1872 Mining Act with foreign interests. There's another one that's got a permit in the exact same space for Tono Autumn, where the village was destroyed. There's another foreign mining company that is proposing and asking for a permit, and I think it might have been granted. That was submitted in 2019.
I would just share, Mr. Chairman, part of the reason that we have all these foreign-owned mining companies is because of the uncertainty of the permitting process. What goes on with NEPA? Why would you, as an American, take your capital and invest in a project here in the United States of America? Isn't that correct, Mr. Adams, that there's a great discouraging of having domestic manufacturing?
Yeah, and on the coal side, because our permitting, there's an amazing amount of coal in the U.S., okay? But from what's permitted, we're in danger. We're looking at 15 to 20 years, and the financial investment that has to take place. If I go win an LBA and I have to come up with $500 million to buy that coal, I have to pay that in the first 5 years after getting it. It's going to be at least another 7 years before I get a penny of revenue off of that.
By the way, if we could go back to the State of the Union last night, President Biden saying, look at these companies that are having all these stock buybacks and things like that. Why would they invest in America, in American energy, when they may have a stranded asset in the very near future with trying to shut things down? I mean, I have a natural gas-fired plant up in Superior, Wisconsin, that is almost done with the process of being able to build now, and it would augment the intermittent sources of power that are being built around the Midwest. The EPA, the Biden EPA, just came in the last 6 months and said, you got to go through a more detailed permitting process. Delay is death. And so they're really discouraging people from being able to invest. And so why would they invest when you see that? Mr. Holloman, would you expound a little bit more? You heard from Representative Stauber about these foreign sources and how there are going to be foreign countries that are going to benefit from what is supposed to be bought by in America. Could you expound on that a little bit more?
Sure. You know, China took a bet a long time ago, 15 or so years ago, that they don't have a bunch of mines either. And what they did was they built processing. They built a lot of processing all across the, future technological mining industry, copper, cobalt, lithium, nickel. They built the processing there to make the products such as sulfates or precursor cathode active material or cathode active material. And that is now where you have to sell your metal if you're a big producer. There are partners of ours that are big companies, a Glencore, for example, that is trying to do the mining correctly, and they don't have options to sell their cobalt, even if they have one of the few mines in the Congo that mines properly and is watched, and they only use proper Western practices, but they have to send it to China because China has the only processing. We don't have any processing here.
I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Montana who got a chance to visit in his district last year, the only platinum and palladium mine in the United States. Mr. Rosendale, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And as we've spoke, that's not the only place that palladium and platinum is located in the United States. It's just the only place that it's permitted. That's part of the problems that we were running into. Mr. Summers, a moment ago, you referenced the national monuments and the amount of land that has been pulled out of potential production and productivity as because they have been designated as national monuments. So my question is that these extremely large tracts that have been pulled out, it's causing a lot of problem to have access to the valuable resources that are located beneath them. In your opinion, what do you feel was the original intent? Because that's what we rely upon here, the original intent of the size and the purpose of the designation of a national monument was, and do you think that a clarification of the language would be very beneficial?
Absolutely. The Antiquities Act, I think, has been abused in recent decades to lock up mineral resources and for other purposes for which it wasn't intended. If you look at one of the original national monuments, which is the Natural Bridges National Monument in Utah, in southern Utah, that has some of the most beautiful natural bridges that you'll find anywhere in the world. That was a monument that was designated by Teddy Roosevelt, and it's 7,000 acres. The Bears Ears Monument that we've been fighting over for the last 10 or so years was originally 1.3 million acres. And so you're locking up a lot of land, and some of that land absolutely should be protected, but a lot of it, it's not necessary to have that level of protection on. The Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument is 1.9 million acre national monument, one of the largest that we have, and that locked up a large amount of our coal reserves in the state. Some of the best coal that you'll find anywhere was locked up because of that national monument. So I think that we need to get back to the original intent, which is to find those landscapes and those cultural resources that need legitimate protection and protect those with, national monument or whatever other designation is appropriate. But also part of that is that when you have those national monument designations, there's not resources that come with that. So there's not an appropriation from Congress that says we're going to give you the resources that you need to appropriately manage this land. And so you'll have, 1.3 million acres of land that's designated, and you've got a couple of BLM law enforcement that are supposed to patrol that whole area. And in some cases, we're finding actually more degradation to the cultural resources than we had before.
Sure, and again, do you feel that we could have some clarification to the Antiquities Act to try and straighten some of that out?
Absolutely.
I would love to hear some recommendations from you on some of that language that we could try to incorporate. Mr. Holloman, we appreciate you coming here before this committee, shed some light on just how difficult the development of critical and strategic minerals are in the United States. Despite us being one of the leading consumers and developers of electrification, You highlight just how reliant we are on our foreign adversaries for these technologies, specifically mentioning that 90% of the world's cobalt, nickel, and rare earth minerals are being processed in China, a country that we are constantly in competition with, as clearly evidenced by the spy balloon which traveled over our country, specifically Montana, looking at our ICBMs in an Air Force base all of last week. Your company, U.S. Strategic Metals, is an example of how feasible this can be, if only the federal government would let us. You had one line in your testimony that I think is rung very, very clear to a lot of people sitting in this room today. The best time to act was yesterday. The second best time to act is today. I seek to act today to defend ourselves against foreign reliance on these minerals. And my question for you is, what, in your opinion, are some of the specific actions that Congress can put into motion to allow for these domestic capabilities to develop, and how can we prevent the administration from continuing to block mineral development in the United States?
It's a great question. Thank you, Congressman. I think the important thing is to be involved in this domestic content negotiation that's going on with the IRA. It has been passed. It's about to go into action, and we need to make sure that the content of the batteries for electrification are made in America or free trade agreement countries. This is going to be a big ask, and we're going to have to get our GMs, our Fords, our Teslas involved in this. And I think that, the Congress can do a lot in making sure that that happens. There's another thing we have to do is debunk everywhere you see it, the narrative which is coming out that it's too late. I just read an article where they have people on the Hill saying Chinese presence in the electric vehicle market is already nearly ubiquitous. Corporate partnerships between Chinese and foreign automakers, including those in the U.S., is standard, and that reaching America's climate goals without Chinese technology would be exceedingly difficult. We must stamp out this narrative. We can handle it here in America. We cannot yield to this position that we have to use Chinese technology. It just happened in Virginia. You had CATL, a great Chinese company, but coming in, and they wanted to build battery manufacturing with Ford in Virginia using Chinese technology, and they wouldn't show us the technology. We can't have that. We can do all of this stuff ourselves. We just need your help.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Holloman. Mr. Chair, I would yield back. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to recognize Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just sat there and let you preach on all day. I want to start out, I just want to echo the reflection comment that Mr. Curtis made earlier. As I've been sitting here, I've been reflecting as well. And I campaigned on reeling in China and moving away from a dependency on China. But as Mr. Rosendale stated also, China's not our friend. That's evident by the balloon that they sent over us last week just to surveil us. And I really believe that the American people now have begun to wake up to China, if nothing else, than about a year and a half ago when they saw their Christmas goods sitting off the coast of California that we couldn't get. So, Mr. Adams, I appreciate, I knew you had an opinion and you commented on China as well as Mr. Summers. I've heard you comment on it too. But I wanted to ask a question of Mr. Holloman, because in your testimony, you discussed that we have seen China emerge as the unquestioned leader in the minerals market. And what factors caused the United States to fall behind during the same period that China became dominant?
Thank you, Congressman. We did not have strategic will. Our country was always getting things for, the cheapest and the quickest and just in time. China started thinking about this many, many years ago. I was in Africa in the early 2000s, going around to different countries, business meetings and government tenders. And the Chinese were all there. They were out tendering for for African mining concessions. They were in Latin America getting mining concessions. They were in Indonesia getting mining concessions. This is China Incorporated the will of a country to go out and secure the future of raw materials. We were absent. America, just to be blunt, we were very lazy. And that is something that has to change. And I think the only way it changes is when we realize that we cannot control our own destiny.
Well, having said that, what do you see as, I don't know, national security implications of U.S. lagging behind China like that?
For the military, I don't know what our DoD stockpile for nickel and cobalt and copper and lithium is, but I know it's needed in all of our high-tech equipment. Our airplanes, jet engines need alloys from cobalt and nickel. We don't have any of it. We import 100% of these metals. Our vulnerability is complete. We are completely vulnerable because of the lack of a stockpile and the lack of an ability to produce it here and mine it here. And oh, by the way, we have cobalt here. We have nickel here. In Idaho, in Missouri, where we are, we've got copper. We're also making lithium from recycling. So we can do it all here, and we can also import other metals and process it here. We can import from a company like Glencore. It's ready to sell to an American processing company if we create the processing. I always say, why don't we export batteries? Why don't we export PCAM and sulfate? We can do it, but there are no options for the world's miners, and we're not mining ourselves enough.
Yeah, amen. Good job. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think this is probably a pretty good softball, though. What can we do to close that gap?
Help American companies mine and help them process. And there's a bipartisan kind of feeling around this, because whereas climate change is the fear on one side, there's China and national security is the fear on the other side. Let's talk across the aisle if we can, because I think there are people in the administration that want to help. That's really my recommendation to the House committees. And let's make sure we have this law, this IRA law, which says domestic content. It's got to mean domestic content. No loopholes, no big companies coming in and allowing additional metal from foreign entities of concern. It's written in the law that you cannot use metal from foreign entities of concern. We got to stick to that.
All right, thank you. Mr. Summers, real quick, copper, gold, and silver among many mineral commodities not listed as critical by the Department of Interior. How important is it to increase production of these minerals in addition to resources like the lithium, gallium, and cobalt?
It's critically important. So, I mean, if you look at the mineral demand, a lot of those are for minerals that aren't on that critical minerals list, especially copper. We have one of the largest copper mines in the world in Utah. And, without increasing copper production substantially, we're not going to meet any of these energy transition goals or to be able to supply the copper we need for economic development generally.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
It's no problem. Great discussion going on here. Next, we'd like to turn to Representative LaMalfa. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chivney. Appreciate it. Mr. Adams, I want to just get a little background of, sorry, I've missed a portion of the hearing here, of your company and its ownership there. Is it primarily owned by the Navajo Nation?
Yes, Congressman, we are wholly owned by the Navajo Nation.
Okay. And I know of the Four Corners power plant as well.
That is correct.
It's had some hard times in recent years. What is its current status on operation? Like what percentage of its, how hard are you able to run the plant and such?
So Four Corners power plant is doing very well. A lot of that power is being bought from states west of that apparently don't burn coal.
Any of it sold into California, do you think?
Absolutely.
Oh, California buying that, huh?
We own a percentage of the Four Corners power plant. APS is still the controller of that. The San Juan plant just closed, unfortunately, and we were with some other groups that were very involved in doing a carbon capture project, but PNM, from pressures from certain groups, stripped that plant as quickly as possible so it couldn't be converted to a carbon capture.
How long, is that underway?
Yeah, that's already taken place.
Okay. What was the source of the coal?
Source of the coal from that was the San Juan mine.
Where was that at again?
It's just off the nation in New Mexico, just outside of Farmington, New Mexico.
Okay, thank you. Tell me about the technology in order to operate the plant there. What technology, as far as the cleanliness and such, was most recently in place?
Sure, absolutely. I think, I mean, as I laid out earlier, there's been $126 billion invested by coal companies in utilities into power plants. If you haven't been to a coal plant, if you haven't been to a coal generating electrical plant, you should make that happen. It would, I think everyone would be very surprised at what they saw from a cleanliness perspective, from an environmental perspective, from how the process works. I think that's a very, very important field trip that we would love to work with our partners in West Virginia, just from a proximity perspective, to make that happen for this committee, to understand that process, to understand everything that is taking place from an emissions perspective in the coal plants. As Asia has continued to build out coal plants, they're using the newest, latest technologies.
And let's talk about the output of the effluent, the smoke, whatever, between, let's say, a plant made in 1940 and the one today. How much cleaner are we talking about with particulate, with gases, et cetera?
I don't have those exact numbers.
Well,
I don't
just-
get those
you
for you,
just
but it is.
Spitball it a bit.
What we're doing now isn't even comparable from a tech. I mean, we're 5 iterations of technology past where we were. When people look at pictures of a smokestack at a coal plant, they're like, look at the smoke. Look at that's steam.
I know they play that a lot.
Absolutely.
A lot of steam coming out of things.
Gets played all the time. But the emissions are, I would live on the east side of a coal plant dealing with the wind blowing that over my house all day, every day.
All right, thank you. Mr. Summers, following up on previous conversation, and I've heard a lot in the conversation here about how important it is we have a domestic supply, that we've ceded so much to China, and China has moved in on other countries, and basically has got the market cornered on so many critical minerals and rare earths, et cetera. What's our potential in this country if we had environmental laws that are more realistic about what we need to do at the same time as we're trying to mandate everything to be electrified?
Well, as I mentioned in my testimony, for those 51 commodities that were more than 50% reliant, Utah alone has production or historical production of 20 of those. On the original 2018 critical minerals list, we host 28 of those 35 critical minerals. So again, just in one state, we have the ability to really lessen our dependence on foreign imports. And if you expand that to other mining states, to Arizona, to New Mexico, even California, there's a lot of opportunity to end that reliance. But again, you have to have the incentive for investment, and you have to have rational environmental laws so that capital will come here.
Now, what does the footprint look like usually for a typical mine? I know we've made massive national monuments and set asides, hundreds of thousands, even million acres. What's the footprint of a mine over its, say, 50-year life? How many acres does it need to do the job?
It depends, to be honest, because our big copper mine in the state, Rio Tinto Kennecott, is a massive mine, and part of that is because the concentrations of copper and gold and silver, palladium, other things you can get from that mine is very small. But we also have, the only working beryllium mine in the U.S., which provides about 70% of our beryllium. You can't have an F-35, you can't have an F-22 without beryllium. That's a fairly small operation.
How many acres is that beryllium mine, you think?
I don't know exact acreage.
Just guess, a square mile, what do you think?
I would say it's under 1,000 acres, the whole operation.
Okay, so that's about
a pretty substantial, a fairly compact mine, because the concentrations of beryllium are very substantial.
How about the copper mine? How big is the copper mine, you think, in footprint?
It takes a whole mountain range, frankly. So, it's, you can see
how much scar do you see? How much disturbed area would you see?
It's very visible. It's very visible. But the parts that are actively mined are visible. The parts that have been reclaimed, you wouldn't even know that they've ever been mined in. And that's, I think, a difference between what we do in the U.S. versus what happens in some of these foreign countries where, you know, the environmental degradation is substantial.
Absolutely. I appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentlewoman from Puerto Rico wishes to be recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you, the witnesses, for coming here. Mr. Summers, in your written testimony, you described the U.S. mine permitting system as duplicative, inefficient, and unpredictable. You also explained that the average federal mining permitting process can take between 7 and 10 years. My question will be, can you discuss how these delays put the United States at a competitive disadvantage and contribute to our dependence on foreign adversaries like Communist China and Russia for hard rock minerals?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. And again, that 7 to 10 year time frame is an average time frame, and so there are projects that have been discussed here that are far beyond that. You know, Congressman Sauber talked about one in his district that's, 20 plus years at this point. So I think that when you're talking about, putting us at a disadvantage, if you can go to a country that essentially has, no environmental protections, then, if you're willing to operate there, you can get a mine permitted basically by writing a check. If you want to stay with a country that has similar environmental protections, again, like Canada, Australia, some European countries, and you can get a mine through permitting in 2 to 3 years. If you're looking to get that return on your investment, which in most cases for a large mine is going to be hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of capital invested, and you want to get to that return when you actually start making money, if the difference is between 2 or 3 years and 7 to 10 to 20 years, that obviously puts us at a disadvantage. In some cases, our resources are so good that companies are willing to take those risks and sort of take their chances with those permitting timelines, but it definitely puts us at a disadvantage and again degrades our ability to provide for our own mineral resources.
I am extremely concerned about the China control on the global mineral supply chain. And for instance, according to a 2022 Brookings report, that nation's refined 68% of nickel globally, 40% of copper, 59% of lithium, and 73% of cobalt. And according to our own U.S. Geological Survey 2022 Mineral Commodities Summaries Report, China has the leading supplier, it's been the leading supplier for 16 critical minerals, as well as 25 other minerals our nation depends on. So my question would be, what specific policies or actions will you recommend this Congress to pursue to end this dependence?
You bring up a critical point, which is, part of it is the extraction side, but part of it is also the processing side. So even for, well-developed commodities like copper, we only have 2 copper smelters left in the entire U.S. There's one in Salt Lake City, there's one in Arizona. 2 for the entire U.S. And again, this is a mineral that we use in all kinds of products. We don't have the processing, smelting, refining capabilities for a lot of these critical minerals as you described. And I think that has to be part of these discussions across the board. And for processing facilities, in some cases you run into the same permitting hurdles that you do with an extractive operation because you're still dealing with air quality permits or water quality permits and other things that have to go through a federal permitting process that, as we've discussed, can be that's very antiquated, that's very unorganized, and doesn't have the kind of timelines and certainty that you need to make these substantial investments. Again, a copper smelter, a cobalt refining operation, these are going to be, hundreds of millions of dollars that you're going to invest in these facilities. So I think you have to have more rational permitting. And then again, if there's opportunities to incentivize investment in these type of operations, that's something that the U.S. could do to make sure that, again, we're not, digging up, rare earth minerals, for example, in California, and then we're shipping them off to China to be processed. We're not, relying on China for cobalt or nickel or whatever the case is. Again, there's very few of these things that we can, on the uranium side, we're talking about building new small modular nuclear reactors in this country, which was a great thing to pursue. But in most cases, you have to rely on HALEU uranium that's coming from Russia, because we don't have those enrichment facilities anymore in the U.S.
Thank you. And the other back.
Young lady yields back. I now recognize myself for questions, and I again want to thank this excellent panel of witnesses for your testimony today and for your answers to the committee's questions. And as I've listened in and I think about the situation that we're in, there's several words that come to mind: challenges, opportunities. I see blessings and curses and responsibilities, all of that rolled into one. And I wanted to break that down a little bit and look at the challenges that we face. We could have a hearing like this on every mineral and element that's mined in our country and every one that we depend on. But let's use copper. Let's just look at copper, which is so critical to electrification. And the statistic came out, and it's almost hard to fathom, but the World Bank says that by 2045, we have to mine more copper than we've mined in the past 5,000 years to meet global demands. So think about that. In the next 20, 25 years, we need to mine more copper than mankind has mined in the history of the world to meet the projections. That's a massive challenge. Mr. Summers, you talked about 2 copper smelters in the United States. China has 50 of them. So we can't get, the Chinese Communist Party isn't quick to share data with us on their economy, but we can get data on the U.S. economy. And we know from testimony here, just from other hearings we've had, that America is blessed with abundant natural resources. A lot of stuff that we can mine. I've done a lot of work, and staff's done work with USGS, and I've actually got a report here that I'm going to submit to the record. It's the 2023 USGS Mineral Commodity Summary, Figure 1. And my question to staff was, how big is the mining industry in the United States? What does it look like? And we all hear about value-added processes. Well, if we look at what we dig up and what we recycle here, some of that gets exported, some of it gets used, but what we keep here from mining and recycling, it's a net of about $120 billion, the value of those raw materials. So you take those and you get processed minerals out of it. Now that value-added process from $120 billion, when it goes through smelting and the next stage, the value of that comes up to $923 billion. So you get almost 8 times the value from what you mine and recycle as to what you've processed. But the real number and the mind-boggling one is what happens after you get that processed mineral and you start manufacturing things out of it. Now, maybe we've painted the picture that mining is not strong in the United States and that further processing is not strong, but still that $923 billion of processed minerals, and part of that are minerals that we import, adds $3.3 or $3.6 trillion to the U.S. GDP. Now, again, we could break this down, and we're trying to get the numbers on everything that's mined and processed in the United States. But just think back to copper that has such a huge demand on it. We've got 2 smelters. China, we know, has got at least 50. How much of our GDP are we exporting when we buy those manufactured goods from China that we could be producing right here at home? So that's a huge opportunity. I don't think we really stop and recognize the economic opportunity that we have here in the U.S. So we've looked at challenges, opportunities, the blessings we've got. There's curses associated with mining. And we know that there are some terrible human rights violations around the world. These are pictures from the so-called Democratic Republic of Congo. It's child slave labor, forced labor, digging the stuff out of mines to go to Chinese refineries to make stuff to ship here to the United States and around the world. Now, we have cobalt, we have nickel, we have a lot of these deposits here in the United States, and with the insatiable appetite for more minerals, the mining is going to happen somewhere. This, regardless of who owns these companies, this will not happen in the United States of America. Under no ownership will American citizens allow this kind of human rights abuses in the United States. So do we want to stand by and watch this continue to happen in other parts of the world because we have a not in my backyard policy here in the U.S.? So these are the things I think we have to come to grips with, is to how do we responsibly use the resources that we have here? How do we meet these massive demands? And how do we do it with the most environmentally sound practices without human rights violations? Actually, would be increasing the benefits to humanity by not only providing these materials, but providing phenomenal paying jobs by growing our own economy. And that value-added process, it could be a huge boon for the U.S. But that gets to our responsibility. The responsibility as members of this committee, as members of Congress, as to how we're going to move forward. And it should be bipartisan. If it's regulatory issues that are the problem, we should fix the regulatory issues. If it's oversight, we should we should have the oversight and use the power of the purse of Congress to make sure that these things aren't happening around the world, that we're creating good jobs in America and that we're growing our economy, and we're pushing back against these supply chains that in this area of energy, it's coming from China. There's other countries as well, but the part that we should really be focusing on is doing away with China, so supplying these goods. So the question to the panel is, where should our focus be? We brought you in as experts to coach the committee, and we're getting ready to develop legislation. What should we put in that legislation to accomplish these goals? We'll start down on the...
Thank you, Congressman. I think you have to start by agreeing to agree, because both sides should agree on this. We can't export our pain while we buy an iPhone, but we are against a cobalt mine in America. That is just exporting the pain to Democratic Republic of Congo. We need to stop companies that do these practices from being able to sell their metals into America, and we need to streamline these laws, right? We need to streamline the laws that you're already looking at, NEPA and everything else, so that we can do it responsibly and well, and do it together. And I have to say, the not only is that happening, but think of carbon footprint. I mean, the right side is not really well represented, but this group is very worried about carbon footprint. That cobalt goes twice around the world to end up in your iPhone battery or your Tesla battery. Twice around the world, 50,000 miles. That is the average lithium-ion battery metal travel. If we were doing it in America, you could have 2,000 miles as the carbon footprint. So there are great arguments on both sides of this. We need to do it together. I would start with streamlining technology, raising awareness, not accepting metal from these types of places.
Mr. Franklin.
Thank you for the opportunity to answer that question. Just start with tribes, end with tribes. That's kind of a way we like to reference when there's regulatory actions that are taking place that impact us. So in other words, meaningful consultation upfront, talking to tribes, avoiding these mistakes that are made. The one that just happened with Reno Sparks Indian Colony at Thatcher Pass. Meaningful consultation that takes into account strategies that we can implement to avoid sacred sites, avoid cultural resource areas, avoid poisoning the waters that are going into tribal faucets. I think that if we can put that into legislation and strengthen the existing ones and find places where it's not at, that we can adequately mine and not on the backs of Indian tribes, but like my brother here, with Indian tribes. And that's what I would ask you to consider as you move forward.
Mr. Adams.
I agree with Chairman Franklin. We need to make sure that eco-colonization isn't taking place on our tribes. Where this year, where the Navajo, with drilling at Chaco Canyon, the tribe represented and did the analysis and said, we need to be at 5 miles from Chaco Canyon. And the federal government came in and said, nah, 10 works. That's the other side. I mean, eco-colonization has to stop. To answer your question on the smelters and what we need to change, if we're going to go from 2 smelters to more, if we're going to continue to participate and keep up with world growth, we need energy. If we don't have enough electricity sitting on our grid, it doesn't matter how many smelters we have. We have an issue where we need to focus on baseload power. Coal is not the issue. Emissions are the issue. You know, President Biden said last night that we are a resilient country that has always moved forward. We're innovative. Then let's find the answers. Let's invest in the science. Let's find the answers that's going to drop the emissions to a level where we want them to be, but continue to use coal at a base level, our 20 to 25%. No one is arguing saying coal should be 80%. We're saying we need to stay at a baseload level to keep incubators running in hospitals and keeping people warm and cold when they need to be, and to keep industry running. As we come into an EV economy where we need more power, this is the wrong time to be getting rid of coal. We need that baseload. No coal company in the world is going to come and say, hey, there are these other great green solutions that solve the problem, and we're going to argue against that. But that's not our reality. We need 50 years for the technology to be there. Rely on cheap, reliable coal to get us there.
And before we go to Mr. Summers, I want to address that for just a moment. I'm the optimistic engineer. I've always said we shouldn't demonize the fuel source. We should work to achieve the objectives we want to achieve with the fuel. I've had numerous groups come to me in the past few months telling me about new carbon sequestering technology where you strip the carbon off, or somehow you take the carbon and you put it in a slurry, you inject the slurry into a deep well, and it turns back into rock. You could potentially have carbon-free energy from burning coal or burning natural gas if this technology is developed. So I think we have to continually push the envelope. That's what's going to change energy development around the world, is when American ingenuity comes up with the most reliable, most affordable, and the cleanest, by whatever definition of clean you want to use, that other countries will adopt.
I completely agree. And we believe in the innovation of the American people. We're not quitting on them. We're not going to say, no, we can't do it, and just get rid of whatever it may be. We don't understand why we're doing it with coal.
Mr. Summers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to second what you said about, American ingenuity, and especially in investing in new technologies. And I think that the federal government has a very useful role to play, because the federal government has the resources to take those R&D risks and the commercialization risks that are very difficult to be borne by private industry in many cases. And so I think that ensuring that our federal agencies and their federal programs that have adequate resources to invest in those kind of new technologies so that we can take advantage of American ingenuity and keep our energy economy going the way that we need to. But also on the processing side, there are new processing technologies where you can go into waste streams, where you can go into tailings pond and pull out minerals that would be lost otherwise and would have to be developed elsewhere, and inject those into the value stream as well. Just to give one example, our copper mine that I've talked about, just recently they opened up a tellurium circuit. So tellurium is a mineral that's used specifically in PV cells and solar panels. And most of that was coming from China again, but there was a U.S. company that decided that they wanted to source this mineral from the U.S. They went to Rio Tinto Kennecott and said, can you pull this out of your waste stream? We'll pay for it. We'll pay the extra money that it's going to cost so we don't have to buy it from China. It's pulled out of that waste stream. It's sent to Canada to be processed, and then it comes back here and it's put into solar cells. And frankly, those cells are more expensive than what you get from China. And so if there's going to be incentives for solar production, then make sure that those incentives are directed at North American or U.S. product streams as opposed to, again, being able to be pulled out of other countries. And I think, too, just in general, especially for these minerals that we need, the critical minerals, the minerals that we need for national defense systems, the federal government has to insist on domestic sourcing for those. Again, I mentioned you can't have an F-35 without beryllium. Part of the reason that we have beryllium is because the federal government decades ago decided that they wanted to invest in developing our beryllium resources here in the U.S., and now we're the major producer of beryllium. 80% of the market is controlled by the U.S., and that's because the federal government decided that they needed to make sure that beryllium that was needed, especially for airframes in this country, was coming from the U.S., that we controlled that supply, and we need to do that for all kinds of different minerals so that, again, we don't have a critical minerals, we don't have a national defense system that relies upon one of our adversaries to give us that mineral in some cases that you've never heard of, but that you have to have for an alloying process, that you have to have for, for magnesium, that you need for, defending against an airframe against missile attacks. I mean, those are all things that, again, most people don't think about, but our folks at DOD and other places within the federal government think about that. But in many cases, they can't go outside of the country to acquire those minerals, and that's just incredibly counterproductive.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Summers. Thank you again to all the witnesses. I could stay here probably all afternoon, but Mr. Grijalva is growing impatient with me over here. We want to keep as much collegiality as we can on the committee. So again, thank you to the witnesses. Thank you to the members. And the members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. Also got a few things to submit to the record. A letter from the National Mining Association. Without objection, so ordered. A letter from Representative Amadei, without objection, so ordered. And under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on Monday, February 13th. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for those responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.